Heather Jones. I'm an author and a designer, and a lot of my work is inspired by everyday things that I see in my life around me. So today I'm going to show you how you can do that as well and choose whatever you are inspired by as the basis of your designs. All of my designs, no matter what their inspiration is, start in a sketchbook. I love to draw. That's what I used to do all the time. So I really love to work this way. I'm typically drawn to linear design, so that's usually what all my pictures are of. Today I'm working on this photograph, and I printed it out. I had it printed out so that I could refer to it and put it in my sketchbook later on. And it's a log cabin. It was built around 1811. But I really was interested in these four bars that are the logs, and then these three squares where the two meet. And so that's going to be the basis of my design. I always start with a rough sketch, and once I'm happy with that sketch, I draw it out more clean and neat and add color. So that's what we're going to do now. So as I said, I just really start rough and just kind of use a pencil so you can erase any lines that you don't like, and draw a rough outline of the area of the design that I want to focus on. As I said, I was really drawn to these three sections here and then these cross logs. So that's where I'm going to draw my inspiration from. And in this part of the process, you can be really messy. This is just a way to get your creative juices flowing, to try to figure out what area of the design you want to focus on. So you don't have to be neat with this part at all. It's just a good way to get your ideas on paper, and you can do this a number of times if you want until you're happy with the design that you have drawn. So once I have my rough sketch, I'll go back and then think about the size of the quilt that I want to make. And for this one, I thought it would be nice to make a wall hanging size quilt. So I'm going to flip ahead to another drawing that I've done, cleaned up and to scale in my sketchbook. The nice thing about working with graph paper is that you can draw your design to scale, but then you can also use the squares of the graph paper to help you determine how you would make the piece once you have it designed. So in this instance, I've drawn my mini quilt, my design, 15 squares wide and 20 squares long. So each square is equal to 1 inch here if I want to make a quilt that is 15 by 20. And that's a good size, I think, for a wall hanging. This project, by the way, will be a free pattern on the website, so you can refer to that later if you'd like. The next process, once you've got it all drawn out, cleaned up and nice and neat, and I forgot to mention that I also use a ruler for this section too, just to get these nice drawn lines as straight as possible. Once you're at this step, then you start thinking about what would be the easiest way to put this together. So it's kind of like reverse engineering. And with the design that I made, you can see it's basically two columns. It's a series of a narrow column to the left, made up of squares and rectangles, and then a wider column to the right, made up of rectangles, wide ones, and then thin ones. But to me, that made the most sense and the easiest way to put it together. So then the next step is figuring out what size pattern pieces you need. And again, we're using the graph paper, we're using simple math to calculate this. So for instance, these three squares in the pattern are the same. And if you count the squares up, they're 4 squares by 4 squares. So keep that in mind. That's the size of that, and I would name that piece. We'll call that piece A for right now. So A is 4 by 4. But one important thing that you have to keep in mind when you're working this way is you have to add a seam allowance to that piece. So this 4-inch square is really 4.5 by 4.5 because you have to add 1/4 of an inch on each side of the piece to come up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you do that for all of your pattern pieces. You figure out the dimensions of all of the pieces with their seam allowance. Once you've got that done, it's time to add color. Looking at the inspiration again, if you wanted to be very true to life and choose the palette, you could use colors that were that you see right in the photograph. But I think it's more fun to come up with your own color palettes, and that's what I typically do. I knew I wanted to kind of keep these gray tones that were in my inspiration, so I chose 3 solid colors to work with: a light gray, a dark gray, and then kind of a chartreuse greenish yellow. So just kind of color in your sections right now. And you can be as neat as you want during this process, or as messy. This is really just for reference for you as you're working on your project. So I'll just fill this in just to put some color down. It's also nice to work this way and refer back as you're working on your project, so you can get an idea of what your finished quilt will look like. So most of mine is dark gray. I've got a little bit of light gray in these thin rectangles, and then the pop of chartreuse in these 3 squares. Got all of my fabrics cut out, all of my rectangles and squares cut out, and now I'm ready to sew these last 2 columns together. I always pin when I'm sewing because I don't want my fabrics to shift, and that can always happen as you're sewing things together. I'm just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and going to sew these together. With all of these other seams that are behind me, I also like to, and you can see I'm slowing down a little bit, to make sure they don't flip while they're being sewn together. And just about done. And I always back stitch to lock the seam. And here's the finished quilt. You can see how it came together once it was done. I chose to quilt straight lines, and I typically do them vertically, but for this quilt I chose to do them horizontally in reference to the inspiration again. So the wood has these nice grain lines. Again, it's not a complete or an exact duplication, but it certainly is a reference to the inspiration. And the thread I used was a light gray cotton thread, quilting thread. And I chose light gray because I felt like it worked with all 3 of the colors. But not only that, by adding these lines of stitching, it sort of breaks up all of this dark gray that is in my background. So let's take a look at some other projects that I've done working in this manner as well. This quilt is called Mason. It used to be called Yield, and it was made for a design challenge put on by a guild. It was really the first quilt that I made in this manner, where I found inspiration in an everyday place and created a quilt design out of it. This was inspired by a parking lot, a painted grid in a parking lot of a big box retailer, and I never dreamt that I would find inspiration there, but you just never know when inspiration will strike. And here's the design for it in my sketchbook too. This quilt is another small mini quilt that I've made called Springfield. It has 109 applique circles in 9 different sizes. They're just raw edge appliqued, lots of tiny circles. It takes a while to cut out, but I think the effect is really worth it. And this is my Eden Park quilt, another small mini quilt that was inspired by bricks of a building, an art museum in my hometown. And I really love the variation of colors and the pop of yellow. I hope you learned a lot in this segment today, and I hope even more that you'll find inspiration where you're from and create things based on that as well.